Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this session where we will be taking you through what you need to know to build an effective incident response plan. We have a fun session planned for you today, but first, I have some housekeeping items to cover. So first, we're going to aim to run about 60 minutes, and we do encourage you to stick around till the end. We are going to be doing a $25 gift card raffle. This webinar is being recorded, and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the event. One item you can have access to right now is a planning worksheet, which is linked in the materials section. You can use that to follow along with our expert speaker today. And lastly, attendees are in listen only mode, but this is going to be an interactive session. So I encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function as we go. I will be interrupting Martin as we go along to ask you your questions so we can get to them while we're speaking about these topics. With that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. First off, my name is Stephanie Hamrick. I am a marketing manager at DataPrize, and I will be your moderator for today. And joining us as our expert is Martin Badinelli, who is our Director of Security Advisory at DataPrize. Martin has over a decade of experience in cybersecurity, helping organizations to strengthen their security posture and develop effective incident response strategies, which makes him such a valuable resource for us to have with us today. Thank you, Martin, for being here.
Of course, happy to be here.
Next, I'll tell you very quickly about DataPrize for those who don't know us, and then we'll get right into it. So DataPrize is a national managed services provider. We have been providing services end-to-end for our clients across the United States since 1995. We believe technology should enable you to be the best at what you do, so we strive to deliver best-in-class cybersecurity, network, infrastructure, collaboration, and end-user solutions to help you get there. So with that, I am going to hand it over to our expert, Martin, who will share what's in store for us and then take us through it. I will be
Awesome.
watching the Q&A, so if you have any questions as we go along, again, please put them in there and I'll be calling them out. Martin, over to you.
Aw- Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you everybody for joining today. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about incident response planning. Depending on where you are on your kind of cyber maturity journey, I'm hoping that this will be valuable, kind of no matter where you are on kind of that, just starting out, potentially considering developing an incident response plan, or maybe bolstering one you haven't touched in a little while, need to hit those yearly updates to meet some sort of regulatory guidance, or, even better if you don't have any sort of regulatory conditions and you're looking just to build kind of the strongest cyber posture that you can. As Stephanie said, I've been working in this field for a while. My team works in security advisory. Um, Kind of what that means is that we focus on where you are and where you'd like to be. And incident response planning is kind of taking stock of where you are from the standpoint of potentially responding to cyber incidents, something we hope doesn't happen, but is, nonetheless very important to prepare for. Today we'll be really discussing these three core areas. That is the key elements or the core elements of a strong incident response plan. We'll also take a look at, common mistakes that we see as practitioners that organizations make, as well as we'll start to touch on a few industry specific considerations, but also happy if there's people in the chat with some sort of questions to either address them or get back to you if it's a super niche question. Happy to take things offline as well and get you the support that you need. As Stephanie said, definitely stick around to the end. Definitely grab the attachment as well. We have a little worksheet that you can walk through as we go through today's presentation that outlines those four core areas of an incident response plan, and will also be tied to kind of some of those mistakes that we see organizations make. With that said, let's jump into. So first off, we'll talk about the phases of an incident response. So today we'll be really heavily focused on the phase one preparation. This is where our incident response plan is most critical. largely because when we prepare well, we'll be able to respond well. So with that said, the phases of incident response go from preparation to detection and analysis. Detection and analysis is of course an ongoing battle where we're constantly analyzing our systems, detecting any potential intruders, and then should an incident arise, go through containment, eradication, and recovery. Um, and we'll touch on each of these a little bit more later on. But the last phase is equally as important to incident response planning, which is post-incident activities. So you'll see there that second bullet point is update our incident response plan, or IRP, based on the findings and weaknesses we identify. We'll also talk a little bit more in depth later on, looping back to phase one, the preparation phase. That last bullet there, we'll talk a little bit about the end about how we can actually stress test our incident response plans through tabletop exercises. Um, Primarily, just because it's so important to how we respond to incidents, it's good to stress test these, before we actually need our incident response plan. And I am also toggling back and forth from the questions, but looks like we got none so far. So we'll jump ahead. So now we'll talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities, really focused on accountability within incident response. So a strong incident response plan, by definition, has clear responsibilities for everyone who's involved in managing an incident. And I cannot stress this enough. The amount of incident response plans that we see when we come into an organization to help them drive their cyber maturity, who do not have named resources, do not have, or even in some instances, named roles. So, if you're frequently going through changes with, an IT analyst, maybe it's, senior IT analyst is sufficient for your incident response planning, but we find a ton of value through naming specific people. So, naming Stephanie or naming Martin and including in your incident response plan their contact information and preferred methods of communication, as well as backups for these roles as well. So think, if you have a head of IT, but he happens to be on vacation and all you have is the head of IT in that incident response plan, who's the backup if you can't get in touch with them? Making sure that you have named backups as well as their information and how to contact people if they're ever, highly out of pocket, is also critical. But we'll walk through these. So defining, who is involved. So this includes both internal and external stakeholders. It will depend a little bit on your business and how things are set up. So if you have a managed service partner like DataPrize or another organization, making sure that you include their contact information and the kind of escalation or communication paths that you've established with your service provider is key. Additionally, and we'll touch upon this a little bit later on in more depth, but if you have cybersecurity insurance, also very critical to make sure that they stay informed of any potential incidents. Um, for a number of cyber insurance providers, they're now providing breach coaches. So if you do have a cyber incident, they're going to kind of take the reins and lead things. So making sure that you contact them as agreed upon in your insurance policy, obviously critical to making sure that you get the coverage that you've paid for. The second key consideration, and I touched it on the last one, is conducting tabletop exercises. So just building out a document and slapping it in a SharePoint or in somebody's email. It may meet the mail for, be it some compliance need where you need to have a documented incident response plan, but more and more, these kind of regulatory frameworks, as well as certainly best practice, is to actually stress test your incident response plan. If you go through a tabletop exercise and determine that, hey, we actually have, a regulatory requirement to, let's say you have uh, a California privacy regulation requirement because you have over 100,000 devices in California and you have a breach that affects over 500 people, you have a requirement to contact the Attorney General of California with that information of your security incident. And if you go through a tabletop exercise and you hit that threshold and nobody brings up that you need to contact the Attorney General, you can revise your incident response plan to make sure that that information is in there to avoid any associated fines. And all these sorts of different regulations and requirements. If you do work in Canada, there's different regulations from Europe, from the United States, and of course the United States has kind of a state by state kind of piecemeal response to some of these requirements. So going through and stress testing is very important. Um, and then lastly, creating a RACI matrix. I'm sure we're all, aware of RACI matrices, but ensuring that we have these documented responsibilities and that people are aware of them, right? If I am the IT director and there's a incident response plan somewhere that says I'm responsible for doing X, Y, and Z, but I'm not aware of that, I'm not actually going to do it. And not being aware is not really going to fly when a regulator says, hey, you were supposed to notify me of this incident, but you didn't. You're still going to get fined whether you say, I didn't know or not.
Mhm.
And checking, looks like no
Awesome.
questions so far.
We have some questions that were submitted before the session started that I think are a good fit here. You talked a little bit about MSPs and how you work with them. So the question is, in a small company, when IT is outsourced, what is the procedure to align your organization's response with the MSP's technical incident response actions?
Sure. So I will say this is going to vary service provider by service provider. Certainly, if you are using Dataprise will walk you through as part of your onboarding, particularly to cyber services, what that looks like and how you'll contact us and how we'll contact you if we identify anything. Certainly, if you have separate cyber insurance or some other agreement with an incident response firm to provide remediation activities, definitely make sure that your account representatives and your account team at whatever MSP or MSSP that they're aware of those and that in some instances, let's say that you have a cyber insurance provider, they may want to be directly contacted by your MSP or MSSP without you serving as kind of the middle person, right? You don't want to delay contacting your insurance provider and getting authorization to be able to start on remediation work because an incident happened at 2 in the morning. Your service provider identified the issue, but they couldn't get a hold of you until the next morning at 10 a.m. If they can cut you out of the process and that's something you're open to, definitely make sure you have that documented. Certainly for some less sophisticated um, managed service providers, the onus may be a little bit more on you to set what those processes look like and what you expect. So it'll vary a little bit by organization to organization.
Awesome. And another question here, what key individuals must be in the loop of any changes made to the incident response plan?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say any named individuals within it are first and foremost critical. So if you switch, the IT director from responsible to only informed, definitely something you want to make sure. You can imagine a situation where two people think that they're responsible for sending out, a press briefing or informing customers of an ongoing issue, and you know, different messages go out or different times, duplicate messages, and it's going to just enhance the kind of customer or stakeholder kind of fear of what is going on. I'm getting multiple messages, I'm getting conflicting messages,
Hmm.
so making sure everybody is on the same page. So that would be number one. And then I would say that additionally, I would probably standardize on updating on a cadenced basis. So certainly yearly, but it depends on kind of industry and turnover in key roles, and making sure that kind of the entire staff is aware of kind of the baseline, how do I respond to an incident? So you can think somebody falls for a phishing attempt, they realize it just after it happens. they should know who to contact, right? In
Mm-hmm.
that instance. So if that's going to change, right, you go from, maybe you used to have an in-house IT organization and you've outsourced to an MSP, making sure that they're no longer sending an email to IT at Acme Company and instead contacting your MSP, MSSP partner when those issues arise is obviously equally as critical as making sure people are aware of what their roles and responsibilities are.
Awesome. Well, those are all the questions I have for you right now, so I'll let you get back to it.
Awesome, yeah, and if any pop up, definitely feel free to shout me down as I go through. So moving on to incident classification, and this is another thing that we frequently see our our partners not have really built out or not even have a framework at all for classifying potential incidents. So knowing how severe something is and how big the impact is obviously critical. So you can do this in a number of different ways. You can use qualitative, like I have here, low, medium, high. We see organizations that go from 0 to 10. Um, and making sure that you have some sort of schema for classifying incidents enables you to make sure that you're contacting the appropriate individuals based on kind of that schema. So, it says there, not all security incidents require the same level of response, right? If there's, one user account got you know, breached through a phishing attack, I'm not aware of any regulatory agency that requires you to contact your entire customer base, right? But if you are storing credit card information, you fall under PCI DSS, and you have, credit cards that go out in plain text, even if you think there may be a breach, you're required to notify customers in a timely manner. So it's really going to depend on, what your business does and how you operate, what these sort of, classifications are going to look like. Um, so financial information for one company might be the most critical information in their organization, whereas maybe at a healthcare provider that is not the most important thing, and instead patient healthcare information is the most important. So it's going to be comparative within your organization. Certainly, you can think of times where something is so critical that it's going to go across those industry bounds. Um, and the second piece here, and it's not as clear on the slide, but you'll see in the bottom right, that bouncing between individuals. The second part here that is important to have based on these severity classifications is a clear escalation path. So at what point, okay, so as I said before, maybe one account takeover doesn't require a IT analyst to contact the CEO or the head of legal or your outside legal counsel. But at what point does that become the case? When do they contact their manager? When do they contact the security department? When do they contact the legal department? When do they contact the executive leadership team, the CEO, outside counsel, your cyber insurance provider? All of those should be clearly defined, and they should be clearly defined because it reduces your time to act. And so you don't want to be in a situation where something that's never occurred before happens and you're trying to figure out on the fly how to react, right? Particularly junior level resources who might be looking at these things on a day-to-day basis. Hey, it's 3 in the morning and I see that the CEO's account just got taken over. Is this something that I call my boss and wake them up in the middle of the night over? If I can't reach them, they didn't answer, do I go to their boss? All those things should be clearly spelled out in a solid incident response plan to make sure that you're reacting in a timely manner, and you need to react in a timely manner to get things back on track in a timely manner. Oop, and I got a screen freeze here, but There we go. So in terms of communication protocols, there's a few key considerations. So you definitely want to make sure that you have in and it's in that objectives box there. You want to make sure you have primary and alternative communication channels. So let's say that you are reliant on Slack or Microsoft Teams, and one of those services goes down. And on top of that, you have an incident. How do you what is the backup methods of communication? Do people have individuals' phone numbers? Should they revert to, you know, email? Um, Making sure that those things are defined within your incident response plan are critical, again, to reducing that downtime and making sure the business gets back on track. Ensuring, of course, that there's clear ownership of the communication and of responsibilities so that so if I go to my incident response plan and I see that this issue has happened, who do I contact, right? So instead of just contacting my boss when I see that, our entire, application is offline, I'm supposed to contact this person, and this person so that it doesn't, I send a text to my boss, he hasn't responded, and then an hour later I call him, and then an hour later he calls somebody else, making sure that those ownership of who to communicate and when obviously very important. And then lastly, those legal and compliance considerations, right? When do we contact our outside counsel, making sure that all individuals who could reasonably have identified an issue that requires seeking legal counsel are are aware that they should be seeking legal counsel or should be contacting, your legal department um, when those things arise. And that's important, of course, for a couple of reasons, right? And any sort of time sensitive and and broadly sensitive issues, making sure that you have, that legal check mark on any actions you take is very important. And of course, secondarily, for any regulatory related, reporting requirements, you're going to lean pretty heavily on the legal team to draft language to make sure that you're reporting exactly what is necessary to be, aligned with any laws or regulations that you fall under. I know that on this emergency communication path, it touches on public announcements, and and I know that a frequent question that I get asked when doing these is if I don't have a regulatory requirement to tell people, should I still tell customers, stakeholders about an incident? And I think that from my standpoint as a security professional, it's certainly a balancing act, and it's a balancing act for a few reasons. And I'll lightly touch on this, but these really get into, some strong ethical discussions that I think are going to require, a little bit of knowledge about a specific business. But you know if I would say there's a strong ethical line for me at who is impacted by this incident. So if you have an incident where customer personal information has been leaked, I think of, let's say, you have uh, and I think this is a readily understandable example. If you have a diary app that you have, and a breach occurs and people could see in plain text every single customer's diary, you know, making sure that customers are aware of that may lead to, the dissolution of your business as a whole, right? People don't want other people reading their diaries. But at the same time, I see the duty of care of notifying people as stronger in that instance. But of course, everything's not so clear cut as that. If my password got leaked, but it's in a hashed format, do I need to contact all my customers? Those sorts of, get probably more towards the other side where, maybe you don't need to notify every customer and, scare them, the short-term business impacts. I will say though that the that if you fall under any sort of regulatory requirement, it's becoming more and more common that you're required to notify in fairly short time span. And we've actually seen, in recent years, examples. I think of Norsk Hydro, where a timely reporting of a security incident actually strengthens customer and public confidence in your response to cybersecurity incidents. Coming out ahead of things, notifying customers, letting them know, hey, I've got cyber insurance. Hey, I've got this team from DataPrize, from Microsoft. I've got boots on the ground. They're working to remediate this. If there's any more updates to come, we'll let you know. Right now, here's the scope of what's occurred, and we'll let you know if there's any changes. In the past, the stock market says, short term, these are problems, but in long term, approaching these things with delicacy kind of leads to long term returns. And that said, that kind of approach with delicacy is largely why we're here today, right? You don't want to be,
Hmm.
shooting from the hip when customer data, healthcare information, payment information is on the line.
Hmm. That's really great information. Kind of, I think, related to this question that we had submitted during registration. How detailed should our communication protocols be during an incident? It kind of sounds like what you're saying is very, very detailed.
Yeah, so I would say the strongest incident response plans that I have seen include things like draft communications to customers. So if this happens, this is the draft email that is going to hit every customer's inbox. And doing those things gets ahead of, you know, like I said earlier, all of this is to reduce the time to getting things back on track. So if it, is the case that you have an incident and customers' payment information has, come out and is accessible to some sort of attacker, you don't want the first time they hear about that to be on the local news. You want for your client customer confidence to be the one who's notifying this and telling them, we've got this handled. Yes, this has happened, but we're already working to fix it. Don't worry about it. And if you need to have people sitting down, drafting communications, I know when I send an email to customers, I'm double checking it myself. So imagine there's a breach. How many times are you double checking and triple checking those communications? Is it being reviewed by, the head of legal, the head of marketing, the head of, is the CEO reviewing it? All those review cycles just extend the timeline to notifying customers and ensuring them that things are going to be, resolved shortly. So the answer, yes. It'll depend slightly on the nature of your business, but the more detailed, I think, the better, and the quicker you will respond to potential emergencies. But of course, it's also a balancing act, right? You don't need to prepare for every possible scenario, but I think that documenting potential risks, classifying them with severity, and building out some kind of standard plans of attack on how to go about communicating and responding to those is, of course, why we're here today.
Hmm.
So, in terms of documentation, so uh, I just kind of said, the more detailed documentation, the better with response to communications. So it's probably no surprise that documentation is going to be a key piece here on kind of every step, right? So from detection, analysis, eradication, containment, all the way through recovery, making sure that you're documenting everything is really important to not only making sure that you are, improving your incident response plan at the end of, the potential incident, but also making sure that, within, let's say, the eradication phase or the containment phase, making sure that you've documented everything, is critical to ensuring that you've actually done that, right? If you have a list of every computer that may have been, impacted by a potential breach. You want to make sure that you've actually gone through and checked to make sure all of them are restored appropriately. So documentation on from that standpoint is important. Making sure, depending on what your requirements are, filing a formal incident report, um, be it to a regulatory agency or to the senior management is important to develop a timeline of events, be able to accurately know in like the days, weeks, and months ahead, how could things have been improved? Um, Obviously, very important. If it took, 8 hours to do one step that should have been, ideally 15 minutes, you want to make sure that you address that in your incident response plan going forward so that you, again, get that time to restoration as low as possible. And I'll just in the interest of time, I'll skip over these, ensuring secure storage and accessibility and maintaining accurate timestamps. They're a little bit more applicable in the instances where there's either ransomware, there's backups that you're potentially restoring from, or there is, some sort of, you know, goal to do some forensics, to either pursue criminal action, to go for lawsuits or in insurance claims, but not every customer is going to have those concerns. So, but happy to take any questions that people have a little bit later on. Likewise, I'm going to be a little bit light here on cyber insurance coverage. While it's certainly booming, this industry, and we see more and more of our customers with cyber insurance every day, and it's something I would strongly recommend that essentially any business at least explore. This isn't applicable to everyone, um, but I will say that ensuring that you dot your i's and cross your t's when you're going for that coverage, making sure that it covers what you think it does, making sure that your executive team, your legal team is engaged in that policy selection as well as renewal is very critical. Making sure that your coverage matches your risk profile. If you only have $100,000 worth of coverage, but you might have $100 million worth of potential liabilities, obviously that insurance policy is for naught. Um, and knowing how to engage your insurance provider. This is something that I see, time and time again is a big issue for, broadly individuals or organizations who have contracted cyber insurance. You likely have requirements on when and how to contact that cyber insurance provider, and it is likely that, as I said earlier on, that they will kind of take the reins and own kind of the go forward. Very similar to, if you have an auto insurance claim, they're not going to have you also select, the body shop that is going to do the work and sign off on, the invoices without them being involved somehow. If you have a cyber insurance provider, making sure that you're following their process for getting an incident response company or incident response provider. They may well have an organization that they work with, they will contract on their and your behalf, instead of having to go through some other third party organization, having pay for incident response and then paying you back for that. That's fairly atypical. So make sure that you both have adequate coverage and the process for using that coverage is really what it comes down to. So I I think that everything we've discussed so far is important. But if I had, one key takeaway that is the most important, I would say that mandated reporting is the most important. And I say that not only because of the potential legal or regulatory fines or penalties. I say it because it is also very, very critical to any reputational damages. So if you fall afoul of a legal risk, your customer is going to say, it's one thing to fall afoul of best practices. It's another thing to fall afoul of the law, right? Certainly, certainly, spells it out there. But the typical, you know, regulatory frameworks that we're seeing our customers respond to are largely PCI, HIPAA, CCPA, CPRA in California, um, GDPR in the EU, fairly broad, as well as I forget the acronym, but there's I think it's PIDEPA or PIDECA in Canada. All of these have regulatory, stated reporting guidelines that are very strict. So, 72 hours you need to report to customers if it's over this size of breach. Um, and another note that I'll make here, because this is something that comes up in our tabletop exercises quite frequently, as a key finding, is when it comes to legalese, and your legal departments will tell you this, language is important. So a lot of these regulatory guidelines, they call out, severe security incident. Any sort of severe security incident, any breach needs to be reported within X timeline. And so if you don't know what has happened and you're still investigating, something is never a breach until it's confirmed. We see this frequently with our tabletop exercises. People are calling things a breach. There's a famous article from a few years ago called "Don't Say Breach" until your legal department tells you to use the word breach. A customer data breach is by definition a severe security incident and starts that clock ticking to report to customers. So making sure you have a full handle on what things are before, using very strong language, definitely very important. Um, Another key consideration is that internal versus external reporting. External reporting, I touched on this a little bit earlier. Um, you know, the mandated reporting is generally pretty well defined. You need to define who is impacted, at a high level, what caused the impact, as well as, a number of different regulatory requirements have you, spell out some potential remediation actions that customers could pursue, credit reporting, those sorts of things. You have to notify customers of, some of those remediation actions. But really working to develop, in your incident response plan, do you want to go further than mandated reporting, and what is that going to look like is also important. Like I said earlier, sometimes sharing more information is going to be better. Drip feeding, being in the news for weeks while, investigative journalists are digging up more and more information is going to be more damaging than just getting out in front of it and explaining the situation in full, potentially. Um, Kind of going to be an organization by organization basis. And then from an internal standpoint, making sure that you notify customers, team members, things like a broad email to your entire company, notifying them of what happened, and to direct all requests from the media to a specific person. Also very important depending on your organization. And for some smaller organizations, these are going to be, it's going to be very easy to understand for your organization. But even from the standpoint of building your plans to facilitate future growth, another best practice, right? If you're looking to grow, you're a new organization and you've only got, quote unquote, the IT person, and everything's going to go to them, you know, building for a future where that's not the case is important. And then lastly, audit preparations, PCI, NIST, they all have requirements for, incident response. Oh, I think my headset cut out there for a second.
It did, but you are back.
Okay, so from an audit preparation standpoint, a number of different regulatory frameworks, if you have an outside auditor attesting to your compliance, are going to be looking for documentation of your incident response plan, are going to be looking for communication matrices, and making sure you have all those stored in a consistent place is going to be crucial to having both passing the audit and making sure that it requires as little effort as possible.
Awesome. And one question on this slide,
Yeah.
real quick, is the acting IT organization, so it sounds like this person may be working with an MSP, expected to make the client aware of the required regulatory response, or is that something that each business needs to know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that it is it it will depend on your relationship with your MSP slash MSSP. If you have some sort of advisor, they can certainly assist in identifying what your regulatory burden is. But typically, I would say certainly at the onset, the expectation is that the customer would notify that service provider of what their requirements are, and then have that service provider support those requirements. Um, just from the standpoint of, if I walk in and I say, I am uh, an online retail vendor, that can mean, a number of different things depending on, where am I operating from? Who am I selling to? Am I selling to clients in Europe? Your MSP or MSSP wouldn't know that you're subject to GDPR without you letting them know, because, your shipping department is just shipping things straight to Europe. Or if you have over a certain amount of customer information within the state of California. Your MSP, MSSP might not be aware that you've hit that 50,000 or 100,000 client in California threshold that then makes you subject to those requirements.
Awesome. It sounds like goes back to what you mentioned a little bit earlier about setting expectations and defining some of those processes with third-party vendors that you're working with.
Exactly, exactly. And it's certainly, the regulatory bodies are very aware that, particularly for very small businesses, um, you might not be aware of your regulatory requirements. Um, but that's typically why regulatory bodies do set minimum thresholds for reporting requirements. So like that, California Privacy Act, it only kicks in when you hit, I think it's like 27-ish million dollars in revenue, or 100,000 customers within the state of California. So if you're just a small business, you probably aren't, you know, falling under those requirements yet, at least.
Awesome. Thanks.
Of course. So, I've kind of hit these while we've gone through, but to reemphasize some common mistakes that organizations make, um, you know, really, I we've seen as practitioners, strong IRPs in place, but organizations still making mistakes on the actual execution of them. And that really comes down to, either unclear roles and responsibilities or outdated roles and responsibilities is something we see often. Oh, Martin hasn't worked here in years, but his information is still there to go contact customers. Ineffective communication, people not following the incident response plan, people not meeting those reporting requirements, obviously very severe, or misunderstanding their cyber insurance policy. Either not understanding how to make a claim or what documentation goes into that. If you were required to have your incident response provider, the actual boots on the ground going around, doing the remediation work, if they had to take notes in a certain format, but they didn't do that, going back and solving that afterwards in order to support your claim to your insurance provider, it's going to be challenging. Something you can get ahead of, just by making sure that your IRP is both well fleshed out as well understood. So I've really hit on a number of these as we've gone through, but some consequences of IRP failures. I imagine that this group that's self-selected to come hear about the importance of IRP probably is aware of at least a few of these, but of course, financial penalties from non-compliance, reputational damage associated with protracted incidents, particularly, right? The average time to remediate, or rather to contain an incident, is now under 24 hours. If it takes your organization weeks, your customers or stakeholders are going to be questioning, why is this so far below the mean, and what else, what other problems are lying beneath the surface. Of course, operational disruptions go without statement. Legal and compliance risk a real emphasis on that, and then communications failures and fallout. Making sure that people are informed, very, very important to making sure people feel confident in doing business with your company going forward. So happy to tailor this if anybody throws a question in the chat, but some key considerations by industry. Not going to spend too much time here, just for the sake of, if we have nobody from the real estate field, don't want to spend time going through these, but we will be sending out these slides like Stephanie mentioned afterwards. So, definitely take a look if any of these industries are where you are operating from. And of course, if there's, any questions that you have, specific to your industry, definitely feel free to either throw it in the chat or reach out at a later time. So, oh, and sorry, I'm freezing up again. But, with that said, I just wanted to, talk a little bit about the Data Prize security team. So we're based out of 15 separate locations. I know we touched a little bit about Data Prize more broadly earlier on, but we're based out of 15 separate locations. We can support on-site, tabletop exercises. We also, particularly post-COVID, have been working to support both incident response plan creation, development, updates, as well as business continuity and disaster recovery, which is very closely related. You see some of our focus industry there, but we work very broadly across industries. And the last piece is that our team is highly skilled, highly prepared, and if you have other security needs outside of incident response planning, we're happy to assist you. Definitely feel free to reach out to me personally. My information will be in the materials that you receive after today's session. I myself am not a member of the sales team, but certainly happy to discuss your particular security needs, whatever they may be, and work to support those. Um, and lastly, while I said I'm not a salesperson, I am my title is within security advisory. And my advice to literally any customer with an incident response plan is to test your incident response plan. And that may mean, engaging my team to conduct a tabletop exercise. If you have expertise in-house, certainly conduct a tabletop exercise in-house, or work with some vendor to get a tabletop exercise done. You do not want the first time you're using your incident response plan to be when there is a significant issue going on. You want to make sure you're comfortable with it, that you've fixed any gaps that came from just whiteboarding it out, and having a handful of people work on it in a shared Word or Google Doc. You want to make sure that broadly your organization is comfortable with the document before you need it. So Stephanie put this together. There's a QR code there that you can scan. There's also that link at the bottom for those who are a little more security conscious about scanning QR codes these days.
It's secretly a test. Just kidding. It's not a test.
You can go there and grab our slick sheet on cybersecurity tabletop exercises. And if you're interested in having Data Prize support you with a tabletop exercise, there'll be some information there on how to engage us for that. But with that said, we have about 10 minutes left for questions, and I'll also shoot it back to Stephanie, who can share some
Yeah.
information about other data prize cyber information. But really appreciate
Yeah.
everybody listening to me chat.
Yes, thank you everybody for being on the session today. And thank you so much, Martin. That was a ton of really great, really insightful information. The QR code on this slide is the same as the QR code on the last slide. And this is also going to link you to an incident response development guide that our cyber team put together that can help you develop a strong incident response plan. So it builds on everything Martin said today and goes into even more detail. So if you scan this code, you will get taken to a page where you can download that guide and also where you can learn some more information about the tabletop exercises that we can help you out with here at Data Prize. So we do have a few minutes here for Q&A, and we do have a few more questions to get to. So I'm going to shout them out. We'll put Martin on the spot. So this first one here, how does one retain documentation to be accessible to be used for an incident if the locations may become inaccessible during an incident?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was recently working with uh, a healthcare service provider who had, incident response plans very detailed to support, IT outages. So let's say, you're a healthcare organization, you have a lot of offices, and you're supporting, you know, patient healthcare, and your processes are online on tablets. You know, when your IT systems go out, are your people going to be in the dark? So in that instance, the advice was to make paper backups of all of their standard processes that were at a centralized, nursing station, backups of, you know, medication instructions, right? If you can only see, people's medication information, if you're able to get into a specific system, that system is highly critical to people's very safety. And so making sure you have alternate processes for that would be the recommendation. It will really vary from business to business and from process to process how in depth you need to be. So I think of the example of if you have a business with offices spread all over the United States and you use a online payroll provider. If you use an online payroll provider, the chances of it going down, if you're using, an ADP or similar, pretty small. And so, does your business operate in a way that it is important enough for you to have a backup process where you have checks at every office location to meet payroll? If your payroll is monthly and, you're relying on a multinational like ADP, probably not. But it would depend on your business and how critical that specific process is. I would say that certainly at least one level of redundancy is important. And for most of our customers, this is kind of built in. So built into either Microsoft SharePoint or into Azure, AWS, Google, Docs. All of these are highly redundant systems. 99.99999, uptime and reliability. And so I would say for most processes that is sufficient. If you have an incident response plan, is it a good idea to have that locally stored on the computers of the head of legal, the head of communications? Yeah, I would say that that's probably a good idea as well, but it'll really be process by process.
Awesome. And another question here, what is the scope of IR? Is it just cybersecurity or does it include environmental and natural incidents?
Yeah, so I would say that a good incident response plan is fairly intertwined with business continuity and disaster recovery, which is typically where I would say that those sort of environmental disasters, if a hurricane hits a building, what are the processes for dealing with that? Typically, that would be a little bit more on business continuity and disaster recovery. But I would say that an organization with a strong incident response plan, if you don't yet have a BCDR plan, it's going to be a fairly light lift and shift over to some of those environmental impacts. And a lot of the processes are going to be, if not the same, very similar, right? How does a business react to a severe problem is going to be the same whether that problem is an incident or the weather or some other factor that rises up.
Awesome. And how do you make your IR plan understandable to C-level stakeholders?
That's a good question. So I would say that the incident response plan should be ideally developed in part with an eye towards senior leadership. So not just for senior leadership, but also they should have input into its creation. So typically, you know, if you're approaching a mid-size or an enterprise-size organization, you have enough depth and breadth in your organization that it requires a little bit of that higher level managerial input to have effective cross departmental collaboration. So they'll be kind of critical to building the incident response plan, but I will secondarily say the tabletop exercises, it is, I would say, the most effective incident response plans, the most effective incident responses, and the most effective tabletop exercises that I have been a part of have all included senior leadership in tabletop exercises. So it certainly can be challenging to align schedules to have the CEO, the CFO, the head of, marketing, communications, and legal to all get together with the IT department, incident response, any outside partners that you may have. But really, we're looking at trying to do it once a year. It's a few hours. And in my mind, the benefits that I have seen and the benefits that the literature bear out warrant that level of senior executive involvement. So I'll throw out that the that SANS, it's an Institute for Security, does yearly polling and audits of their clients, and for organizations that have incident response plans and test those plans through tabletop exercises, the time to recovery in the event of an incident is about 10%. And you can think of, if your organization is undergoing an incident for 10 days, you just saved a full day by testing your incident response plan. And that's just in that one tiny little aspect, and that spreads out, right? The financial penalties of being in breach, the customers departing your company because you've been in breach for longer than they anticipated. All those sorts of things flow from building good documentation and testing it well. And to me, testing it well means including people who are ultimately responsible for the organization and its decisions. A little
Awesome.
long-winded, but I think it's very
But
important.
very valuable. So that is all we have time for today. We have one more slide though. If we didn't get to your questions today, we will follow up with via email with you. But that one last thing before we go, we are doing that gift card raffle for those of you who stuck with us until the end. After we end this session, you will be prompted with a 2-question survey, very fast, very short. We will be picking the winner from those of you who fill out that survey, and you'll have the choice between a Starbucks or Amazon $25 gift card. So check your inbox to see if you've won that tomorrow. We will be emailing the winner. And then I will close this out here with a thank you to our expert, Martin So much valuable information here today, and so much valuable information in the guide that I mentioned on our last slide that we will be sending out to you, that Martin worked on putting all that information together. So please check that out as well. And one last thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you each learned something new from today's event, and we hope to see you again on the next one.
Yes, and thank you, Stephanie, for coordinating all of this, putting
Yeah.
it together. And again, thank you to everybody for attending. And if you do have any questions later on, definitely feel free to reach out to me either via email, on LinkedIn, however is convenient for you.
Thanks all.